But in those days, in those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far. All right, another episode of the Talking Tolkien podcast. I'm Patrick Santino.
And I'm Clifford Vickery.
Cool. Clifford, do we think your microphone issues are finally settled?
Microphone issues are solved for now. This is not a sustainable long-term solution.
Yeah, to be determined. We also, in the one good episode we have of you so far, you had an echo. Just to let everybody know, Clifford has now put a blanket over a couple pieces of wood in the very sparse walls of his room to try to make up for that. We will see how this plays out.
It's science, folks. Don't question it.
All right, cool. So, this episode, Chapter 4 of The Hobbit, what's it called?
On the Doorstep, Episode 4.
Yeah, we're talking goblins. We're talking about goblins in possibly our current culture. We're also hitting up the background of the dwarves and goblins feud. There's a lot of bad blood between them. We're going to start to explain it. And we will take another step in the hero's journey.
Exciting!
Before we jump into Cliff's notes, though, I do want to just say that I'm aware that our conversation about Durin's Day in the last episode was a little rocky, to say the least. We will address this later on when we approach Durin's Day in this book.
I'll apologize in advance for thinking I know more about astrology than I actually do.
No. I think it was good that we had differing opinions and didn't quite understand what's going on, because it's a confusing day.
Differing opinions about science, Patrick.
Dude, no. We're not going to get into this now.
Okay. Cliff's notes.
Yeah, let's do it.
This is Chapter 4 of The Hobbit. So, Chapter 3 left us in Rivendell, just departing Rivendell and the last homely home with Elrond described as the most perfect of places. And so the company marches off into the mountains from Rivendell. It's cold, hard going, climbing up into the mountains. There's an epic thunderstorm during which Bilbo sees stone giants fighting each other. They leads the group to take shelter in a nearby cave. Even though Fili and Kili promise that they scouted out a safe and empty cave, Bilbo has nightmares of a crack opening in the rock and the horses being slowly pulled inside. He quickly wakes up to find that his nightmares are real and yells just as the goblins come out of the back of the cave and capture the whole group except Gandalf. And Bilbo and all the dwarves are led by the goblins down into the mountain. Hot, stuffy caves full of terrible goblins singing and laughing. And eventually they come to the Great Goblin and are presented before him. He's the leader of the colony. All of a sudden, Gandalf appears in a flash, kills the leader and many of the guards. The group escapes, and they're running through dark and winding tunnels. They have no idea where they're going. They can hear goblins chasing not far behind. Gandalf and Thorin stop to fight back the pursuers, and then they continue. But the goblins get smart. They chase them with stealth, silently and without light. Suddenly, Dori, whose shoulders Bilbo had been riding on, is grabbed in the dark, and Bilbo falls and hits his head. So, danger. This is probably the most foreboding and scary chapter we've come across so far. What did you think of it, Patrick?
Yeah, by far. These goblins, we met the bad guys. I mean, we had trolls before, but these goblins, I'd say, I mean, the trolls are kind of, they were evil, clearly, but they were kind of goofy and
bumbling.
Dumb.
The goblins seem much more calculated and malicious.
I don't know if we'll continue throughout this to use the word calculated for goblins, but they actually did seem that here. So yeah.
Yes, indeed.
Before we dive into anything, you got questions?
Well, just another thought on the chapter. It seemed like the narrator felt really present in this chapter. This is something we'll keep coming back to because I know we've talked about it before, but there's a lot of foreshadowing in this chapter. Gandalf also seems all-knowing. I don't know what your thoughts were on that, Patrick, but this chapter, more so than some of the other ones, felt a little bit overloaded with a present narrator speaking to you out of the book and giving a lot of warning about the future.
Well, I think Gandalf in general is pretty wise. You can kind of just go with that.
His wisdom is the reason that he can be all-knowing. And
as far as the narrative being more present, I don't know if I noticed that too much. Maybe it's something comforting to the reader.
Okay.
Yeah, especially since this is the kids' book.
And it's a scarier chapter, and as a result, we have more preparation and warnings from the narrator.
Possibly, yeah.
Okay. All right. So, plot questions. Before they send Keely and Philly to scout out what's ahead, find any caves, there's a quick mention in the chapter, when everybody could see it was absolutely no use sending Bilbo. What's up with that?
What use has Bilbo been on this trip?
Well, I mean, they decided without any debate to send him ahead at the last adventure with the trolls.
Yeah, but I mean, we were talking the last one. We were questioning: is Thorin doing this because he's a coward, or is he actually trying to see Bilbo's worth, kind of thing?
And Bilbo screwed up at the last one.
Yeah, I mean, he tried to steal a wallet when they were all starving. You trust Bilbo? I would actually trust Bilbo to find a really nice, comfortable cave, but that would take... No, he wouldn't find anything that's comfortable enough to his tastes.
All right. So, another aspect. We hear a little mention of this when Gandalf and Thorin turn around to fight goblins, fight off their pursuers in the tunnels. The swords that Gandalf and Thorin took from the trolls, which are these epic elf swords that we heard a little bit about last time. Why do they glow blue in the dark when goblins are near?
In the last episode, I did mention that the swords of Gondolin glow blue, which is where these swords are from. So if I did that, I think I did that. If I did that...
And for anyone not paying attention or who didn't hear the last episode, where is Gondolin and why are these swords important?
So Gondolin is a city from... basically Silmarillion times, which is
well before The Hobbit.
Elrond had some ancestors that were at that huge battle.
Okay.
It was a last stronghold against the goblins in the wars of that time. And so the people there probably always had to be on their lookout. So the fact that they could create some cool swords that glowed blue when orcs were near, basically as signals for themselves, is... I find that to just be one of the many cool little details that Tolkien throws in to his writing and to the whole universe as a whole. Like, these are the kind of little elements that really put Lord of the Rings above the rest, because it's just, that's such a cool idea, you know? Also, just to imagine possibly everybody's swords in Gondolin glowing blue in this night siege that happened when all these dark things were attacking them. I mean, it would, imagine... like 2,000 people with blue lightsabers just fighting this battle against all these dragons and orcs. And
it's like a rave with a bunch of glow sticks.
No, I think it's much more epic than that.
So, any other thoughts on the chapter?
Before we get into the main topics of this chapter, personally, I really liked the harsh descriptions and conditions of the mountains.
Any particular details that stood out to you?
Not really, besides the fact that I will point out that the stone giant reference that was in the book, I thought they did well in the movie with the huge actual stone, like rock giants, like actually throwing rocks at each other. I thought that was pretty cool.
Okay. Goblins.
Tell
me about them, Patrick. What do we know?
All right, so I'm going to run down what we know from the book, and then you're going to hit us with...
a little bit of that culture.
Well, not so much the culture.
Well, okay, references outside of Tolkien. History.
Yeah. All right, cool. So, what do we actually know? These are some things I wrote down. Some are big, so great and ugly looking. There are lots of them. Good at seeing in the dark. They handle you roughly. Laugh in horrible voices. Can sing in unison to the beat of their flat feet. Have whips and are whipping the dwarves and Bilbo. Cruel, wicked, and bad-hearted. They do have a leader. And then at one point they put on soft shoes to hide their beating feet. Clifford, this was the only descriptions I could pick up of them from the book. There weren't actually that many. So I think we should try to rely on what does mythology up to this point tell us about goblins.
So goblins come out of Middle Ages folklore. They're typically small, grotesque, malicious, greedy. The word goblin gets its linguistic roots out of a fusion of Germanic and Anglo languages with Norman language. It's got connections to the words for cove or cave and hollow in a rock or a cliff, and other creatures or creature-related insults like knave and imp. It's got some characteristic connections, obviously not linguistic connections, but characteristic connections to Asian mythologies, where you see a similar recurrent theme of an evil, grotesque mutation of a fairy or loosely humanoid magical creature. So this fits pretty much in line with what Tolkien's describing. Another interesting thing I realized looking into this a little bit is that there's a general connection and sort of confusion between elves, goblins, fairies, in a one particularly prominent collection of German romantic fairy tales. There's a character called Earl King, which translates literally as Elf King, but he's effectively a goblin. So there's a little bit of like cross-pollination and confusion there, but I think the general takeaway is that fairies in mythology tend to be generally positive or ambiguous. Elves go positive or negative depending on the story, but goblins are almost always negative. Like all of their associations are just generally grotesque and bad. And reading the chapter, that's something I took away from it. Is like this fits with what Tolkien's talking about of the different creature types that we've seen so far. Like we've been introduced to a few different types of creatures, but dwarves, elves, and goblins are the three groups that we've seen described en masse. Like where we've come across a group or a team or a gathering of them, their behavior with each other. There's clearly a contrast that's been set up, and the goblins are by far the most negative and evil and malicious. We've heard some positives and negatives for dwarves and elves, but the goblins are effectively, like any chance he's got to give them a negative characteristic or quality, he's doing so.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's interesting what you're saying about how sometimes the elves are portrayed as bad guys in mythology. They're not always good guys, whereas based off our last chapter when we were hanging out in Rivendell, I mean, those elves, I mean, it was the perfect place. All those people were super happy, super nice kind of thing. You assume they're all obviously good guys, like obviously.
Right. Certainly Elrond. We get the sense that the other ones are snarky and playful in a way that...
Yeah, playful but not bad at all.
Right. They're fairly pure.
Yes. So that, I think we still got to hold out more examples, and we'll actually get more examples in this book itself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, what you're saying about the goblins are just always bad.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me is like obviously he's setting up a kind of a moral battle, but he's basically taking cheap shots at the goblins, like listening to the sound of their flat feet or anything like that, where that's basically traditionally an association with a clumsiness or some sort of deformity, just lends itself to a general characterization of goblins being grotesque. Obviously, flat feet are pretty common. A lot of people have flat feet. But it lends a vague sense of mutation to the whole group of goblins. I thought that those sort of little details are interesting because it's like he's intentionally kind of knocking them down a notch.
I didn't actually pick up on that, Clifford, besides the fact that we've already done this episode. But yeah, when you first mentioned that, whenever we were practicing this ago, yeah, that was a good point.
Well, good. I'm glad I'm keeping you intrigued.
What'd you think of him based off the chapter?
I'm intrigued to learn more. They're definitely much more interesting to me than the trolls because they seem, well, they're obviously smarter. They work together. They seem to have goals and ambitions in a way that the other challenges in the story so far have been kind of environmental.
I think they scare you more too.
Yeah, definitely. The trolls also were just in a clearing in the woods. Here he's deliberately set up a spooky setting for them.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly probably because we're on their turf kind of thing.
Right. But it really did feel like he's intentionally given them ambition in a way that we haven't seen yet, which is kind of spooky because we don't know what their ambitions are really. But we know that there's more to it than them just being kind of a hiccup or a roadblock.
Right.
What did you think of them?
I just thought the soft shoes thing was just so funny. Like, what, they're going to change their shoes to chase them down a hallway? Which, I mean, is very practical, but it's just like, you guys don't make soft shoes. Come on, what is this?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, because that's a detail that he clearly could have just made them quiet and sneaky, but then it's easier to make them grotesque if they're loud and have flat feet that make a lot of noise. So then he's got to go out of his way to work him and make him secret.
Another thing I was thinking, like stuff like, oh, they're good at seeing in the dark. They have like a heightened sense of smell compared to like other creatures like elves or dwarves or men or something like that. So they seem, again, more animalistic. Like we were talking about the last time, how there's men, and then it seems like elves are a little bit of a higher being than men. And then it seems like dwarves are a little bit more animalistic than men, like lower being kind of thing. And it seems like goblins are just much lower than that.
Yeah. And other references to that, I remember them talking about the elves running hunched over, the goblins running hunched over. How they can really get going even though they have this kind of crouched posture.
Good point. I thought they were running hunched over just because the tunnels were narrow.
No, but I think it kind of lends itself to them being more like animals.
Agreed. Good point. Nice observation, Clifford.
So, there's an interesting passage in here talking about goblins.
Yes, there was. How about you read it for us, buddy?
Okay, here goes. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get other people to make their design, prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For engines and wheels and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. But in those days, in those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far.
So we came across this passage. We thought it was worthy enough to read out the whole thing. And not only that, worthy enough to break out basically line by line and just talk about it, because there's more than just the current Hobbit story going on here. This should be relatable to anybody that knows any sort of recent history.
Yeah, it seemed like Tolkien taking the chance to go a little bit beyond the specific narrative to make some broader conclusions and judgments.
Indeed.
So let's take this in chunks. They make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but the most skilled dwarves when they take the trouble, though they are usually untidy and dirty.
All right, so the second half of that part is pretty straightforward about the tunnels, but the interesting part, I think, comes at the beginning with they make no beautiful things, but they make many clever ones. So that tells me that they're pretty sophisticated on a practical level. Right. As in, yeah, they can make useful objects. Like, they're capable of making good tools and everything like that. But no beautiful things, so they have no artistic ability about it whatsoever. And usually, throughout history, art's been a pretty defining thing about cultures or civilizations.
Right. So this struck me as, like, they're not dumb and evil like the trolls are.
Agreed.
There's calculated malice there. They're putting a lot of thought into whatever badness they're bringing to the world.
And they're efficient about it.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I can't stress practical enough.
And then the second part of that strikes me as like Tolkien is making sure that they're skilled and talented to make them a threatening adversary, but calling them untidy and dirty is another instance, kind of like the flat feet, where he's basically just piling on the grotesqueness for the sake of highlighting how they have negative characteristics, I thought.
I kind of agree with that, or maybe it's just we don't really care so long as it works kind of thing. Whereas, I mean, the elves clearly, if they were ever going to like craft something, like actually make something by hand and really produce something well, it would be extremely beautiful and great. And hobbits,
the best thing ever.
Hobbits, I mean, if they produce something, it would also be pretty nice, especially if it's a meal. I'm sure hobbits could make like a really nice meal of something.
Thoughtful is what I would say for the hobbits.
And I would even go so far as to say when the dwarves try to make something, yeah, they want it to be practical, because the dwarves are, as we said before, are literally more down to earth than other creatures we met, but they would still hold some like weight to and give some like credence to, yeah, I want this to be super nice. I want this to be not just functional, but I want this to be a well put together thing and attractive to the eye almost. Whereas the goblins are just like, nah, as long as it works, we're good. That's all we want.
Yeah, certainly. So, continuing.
Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, and also instruments of torture they make very well, or get other people to make their design. Prisoners and slaves that have to work till they die for want of light and air.
So, we've got a lot of technology here. Technology related to pain and suffering, I would say, but also efficiency and production, which is pretty interesting that Tolkien has thrown these in together, in my mind. Because hammers, axes, we associate with building and progress. But swords and daggers and pickaxes and tongs, those things are certainly more war-related, it seems. And then the second part of it, prisoners and slaves, I think that's pretty straightforward. So, first of all, I'd say you get an implication of laziness and general laziness, that they don't want to do their own work. The simply inhumane that they would like intentionally keep prisoners and slaves and force them to work. And yeah, like a distinct sense of evil associated with a lot of these instruments and the way they're producing them.
Right. I think you hit it with the inhumane is the biggest thing that struck me here. Inhumane, it just brings up any sort of dehumanizing institution that's ever been around. I think the most applicable thing would actually be lots of the factories that were around at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where, you know, it's the stories of in Britain and America, it's the stories of the people that had to work 6 days a week, 12-hour shifts in the factory, where they're very dangerous, that they could get like a body part stuck in the machine and cut off, and then...
Right, which is pretty interesting. So from Tolkien's perspective, he's associating a lot of industrialism with this like highly negative militaristic view of the world.
Oh, he is. Oh, yes.
It's sort of an early take on the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, I don't even know so much about just the military or just like factories in general. I think we got to keep going with these lines right here.
Okay.
We'll really eventually hit it.
It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices for killing large numbers of people at once. For wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. Thoughts?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
So I'd say similar to the last one, when he's talking about invention and machines and clearly associating them with negative things, with destruction and evil and death, and even wheels and engines grouped in the same phrase with explosions, Tolkien comes off as sounding like a little bit of a Luddite hit here, as though he's anti-technology on the whole. But I take it as he's making a clear connection between war technology and general technology, both in the sense that throughout history, military technology has tended to lead to a lot of technological advances in civil society, but also just kind of seeing perhaps the industrialized progress of the world that he was living in as probably a negative and destructive turn that everything's taking.
Yeah, so let's just talk about the technology that he would have seen in his lifetime. He was born in 1892.
For context, that's at this point the Industrial Revolution is in its prime in the UK.
It was in its prime, but there's still the rural countrysides where they were having all the farms to feed the population. That's partly where he grew up, but as throughout his lifetime, those farmlands eventually disappear and make way for even more factories. So that he was definitely born when it was at the height of the Industrial Revolution in the UK. But
yeah,
it would actually get worse.
I'd like to revise that. I'd say technically the Industrial Revolution already happened well before he was born, because it started actually in the 1700s. In terms of the advancement of technology. But when he was born, there was a significant wave of urbanization, which was sort of not necessarily the same technological change of the Industrial Revolution, but dramatic change in lifestyle.
Agreed. And, of course, too, in his day, we're talking war machines here. He experienced World War I, as we've said before, and for so many Europeans, this was like a huge shock because they really hadn't had a full, real, all-out war since Napoleon 100 years before.
Mm-hmm. And he was a direct witness to it.
Yeah, he was in the trenches. Like, he had to go and fight up against this. And so some of the things that were just in World War I that had never been seen before were the massive artillery step-ups. Like, the last war, there was basically the cannons that you
muskets.
The cannons that you imagine in the Revolutionary War. Now we have the actual huge artillery things that, like, fire missiles, like, miles away kind of thing. Then we also had machine guns. We had flamethrowers. We had chemical gas weapons. You know, they all had to wear the masks for the trenches and everything. We had tanks, and we had airplanes all fighting. Fast forward 20 years past that, we get to World War II, and it's all the same stuff, but it's much more deadly. And then we also have airplanes just bombing huge factories throughout in the middle of urban cities. We have death camps. We have gas chambers and nuclear weapons as well.
Mm-hmm. Remind me, when was he writing The Hobbit?
He wrote The Hobbit probably at the beginning of the 1930s, wasn't released until 1937.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. So when he was writing this, when he wrote that line, he wouldn't even have World War II in mind, actually, which is kind of interesting.
That is very interesting.
It's also good to point out too, you know, when he's bashing on the goblins here and saying anything bad about them, he's not really picking out a specific group in his lifetime. Like, it's not like he's picking out the Germans / the Nazis in this time, or like the Russians or / communists in this time. He was just saying anybody who uses these just clearly evil and destructive weapons today are the descendants of goblins. It doesn't matter who they are, whether they're on the Axis or Allies teams or anything like that. It doesn't matter if they won the war or not. Anybody that uses such destructive weapons, they're the ones he's associating with goblins in this passage.
And yeah, I think that's an important thing to mention, that I would say a lot of his takeaways from fighting in World War I and having a bunch of his closest friends get killed is probably not that it was sort of a holy war, good versus evil. I'm fighting for the amazing allies against the evil Axis, but probably that it's a general malaise of death and destruction in all directions.
Right. Just looking at this, and also not working with their own hands more than they could help. This also just reminds me, yeah, like you were saying, like just laziness on their part. Goblins would probably love like any sort of assembly line, and I'm sure like, you know, whatever their diet is, I'm sure it's just fast food kind of thing. Whereas, you know, like the elves and the hobbits and the dwarves, maybe not the dwarves, but elves and hobbits, it's like, no, they're never going to settle for just McDonald's. Like, they're going to make a nice, well-crafted, balanced, healthy meal. Kind of, maybe not healthy, maybe not super healthy, but like delicious meal. You know, I mean, they're gonna go all out with their quality. You know, the orcs, if they had like plastic, oh my gosh, everything would be made out of plastic, and it would still be good. You could still find it today.
Yeah, the laziness is something that that's a pretty easy association because of wherever you look, Ten Commandments or various texts throughout time, laziness and sloth are associated with sin and evil. So that's a pretty simple, these guys aren't good, and not to mention they're lazy.
All right, cool. And then we hit the big last line. But in those days, in those wild parts, they had not advanced, as it is called, so far.
First of all, my take on what this means. Tolkien saying in those days, meaning when the story is happening, and in those wild parts, specifically this part of the Misty Mountains where the company's passing through, they had not advanced so far. So whatever this society of goblins that they've come across is, it's merely one small slice of the pie of a larger world of goblins. And they're sort of out in the boonies. So even though this is a scary and dramatic experience for Bilbo and the dwarves, they're not even in the thick of it. This goblin king is a nobody, or maybe a provincial lord or something. He's not the king of all the goblins. My takeaway is these guys might be tough, but they're not the epicenter of goblin culture. They're on the fringes. They're part of a larger diaspora of goblins that have spread all over Middle-earth.
Okay. But I feel like that's almost missing the point because, I mean, the key word here is just advanced in general. Like whether
Right.
these are
the point being, there's a larger competitive goblin society at play, and he's talking about these guys specifically. But the key thing being the association between advanced and the society they're talking about, while he's spent the last couple of lines ripping apart the society. So we both thought this was pretty significant, I think. For me, it goes hand in hand with a few of the other things he's been saying, but in more direct terms, where he's associating advancement and progress and development of society with technology, but also military technology and malicious technology, where the ability to produce more death and destruction, we call that more advanced. And so I read this as a critique of basically all the modernized powers, political powers in the world that we consider to be advanced societies. We call these like whatever terms we use, whether no one was saying first world at the time that Tolkien was writing this, but all of the world powers that we consider to be sort of the top societies have gotten their way there through death, destruction, and fairly evil technology. And I think that's a pretty radical viewpoint to be taking.
Yeah, see, I don't know if he's actually... I think by advance, he just means, yes, it's maybe not even sophisticated, but yeah, it's complex. Like, there's a lot to it to operate it kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Like, there's lots of moving parts or whatnot like that. But yeah, are we better off for it? Like, is it a good thing that we've advanced this far? No, we probably haven't advanced at all in terms of, like, producing something that's genuinely good or beneficial to all, or morally good. Which I think he's just saying in general, it's like, yeah, you know, technology comes with its benefits and with its
drawbacks.
Which I think is what you're kind of saying, right?
I'm taking a little bit more of a radical stance. I think he's looking at the world and saying the world is on a downward spiral where we've come to associate basically sinful behavior on the part of society with progress and advancement. And I think he's looking at the world that he sees around him and saying things are on a downward trajectory.
Well, in lots of writing, can be very pessimistic in like personal writing, kind of like his letters or anything like that, or something in his journal. Not so much what he would actually like write as in like books, like. But in general, how can you say that he could really have such a pessimistic outlook when his standard of living is obviously rising for the whole country and his whole world, at least at that point?
I don't necessarily think that he's expressing intense disenchantment on his own part. I think this is more of a philosophical view of the things around him and saying, I think that if we were all, you know, in some sort of pastoral agrarian world, life would be good. And he might acknowledge that has its shortcomings. Like, once again, we've established before, Tolkien sees Bilbo as an extension of himself in a lot of ways. Bilbo is dealing with this struggle for himself, where the Shire and Bag End is a sort of pastoral paradise where everything's easy, everything's good, taken care of. There's just enough technology for convenience, but there's no bad technology, and everything's all sweet, and you can have coffee cake anytime you want. And clearly, we've established that's Tolkien's criticizing that. Like, he's recognizing the need for adventure and for Bilbo to break out of his shell and kind of tackle things that are uncomfortable and difficult. But on the whole, I think that the world that Tolkien's setting up is one where this sort of simpler past is the ideal, is the perfect scenario, and the more technologically advanced and industrialized world is one of evil and death and destruction. And it might be won back. Like, there's an optimistic twist to it. There's a struggle going on. It's not all lost. But certainly he's viewing industrialism with a negative shade.
Clifford, you're an astute reader. For somebody that's supposed to be the guy that has read the book for the first time, you're going above that. Because I think that's what Tolkien would have thought.
Okay, well, I'm pretty honored for that affirmation, Patrick.
Well, you can take that as a compliment, or you can take it as Clifford.
Stay in your lane, buddy.
Well, we already practiced. You got this from the practice episode that we did. What are you doing? Well, we're not going to pass this up. We got to talk about this. Like, is technology good? Like, yeah, it comes with benefits and negatives. Clearly, I mean, like, put out a podcast because of technology. We can check Facebook because of technology and keep up with friends and everything. But are we really better off for that? Tolkien probably would have said no. Well, I'm not going to put words into his mouth. I'm sure he would see the downside to it at the very least.
Right.
On the other hand, too, I mean, there's some really cool things that we've done with technology. To think that in 1903, we flew the first plane. So that was the first time we ever flew. And by 1966, we had landed on the moon. That's pretty insane. And that was all things.
Wild.
That's like the definition of technology there. Too, with the internet, I mean, the information age, I think, is what it's starting to be called. Or it's been called for like the past 20, 30 years or something. I mean, that gets in line with the Iron Age and the Bronze Age. It's like, it's that significant of a thing, whereas those were tools that they used for 1,000-year periods, and now all of a sudden we're just in a new thing where, yeah, we have everything at our fingertips. But are we better off for it? I don't know.
Right.
Probably not. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to say probably not, but
one thing that on that note that strikes me as kind of interesting is a lot of this writing, or you see the old adage, the pen is mightier than the sword, come up again and again.
Okay.
Throughout a lot of mythology, where like a little bit of wisdom goes a lot further than a lot of power, basically. And wisdom almost always prevails in the good myths over power, which tends to be corrupted and evil. But with the information age and the internet and all that, the medium is effectively writing and information, and not necessarily wisdom, but it's shared knowledge, and that is the power. And we still see that it's still being corrupted, of course, and people are still using it for malicious ends. But it's an interesting twist on like every other thing that's come before it, where like every myth can set up a simple, like, are you going to deal in the world of thoughts and intentions, or are you going to deal in the world of swords and rocks? And now we've come to a point where everyone is dealing in thoughts and intentions, but it's not necessarily a moral. It doesn't make things more moral. Welcome back from a quick break after we've rambled on for quite a bit talking about technology and Tolkien's aversion to it. We will return to some other aspects of science and get back into the plot a little bit. Talking about the dwarves. We've just talked about the goblins a little bit. Let's go into the dwarves specifically and Durin's folk. To put this in context, reading this, I heard a handful of references to Moria and the Goblin Wars, some sort of tension between the dwarves and goblins, historic enmity. So, Patrick, let me get a little bit of background on Thorin's family. What is Moria? What do we know about it? And what are the Goblin Wars?
Dwarves are a pretty rough kind of species in general. So to say they didn't get along with goblins isn't a stretch by any means.
You're saying that they don't necessarily get along with a lot of people.
Yes, for sure. Like even elves. It doesn't seem like dwarves and elves get along that particularly well. But and goblins are so evil, as we've said, that it's no surprise whatsoever that they don't get along.
Yeah, it kind of seems like goblins just have enmity with everybody.
They do, but they have a particular hatred for Thorin and his family. So, as we said in the last episode, we were talking about that Durin's Day thing, whatever that is, to be determined, really, for the final analysis of what Durin's Day is. But it will be determined, let me tell you. Durin was basically, he's the patriarch of Thorin's family. So when I say patriarch, think like in the Judeo-Christian tradition of like Abraham. I mean, that makes sense, right?
Family tree is what you're talking about.
He's the guy that started it all. Like everybody's descended from him, kind of thing.
Durin is do you know how many generations back we're talking, or we're talking way back?
We're talking way back. We're talking like multiple thousands of years. We're talking 3,000 plus year kind of things. And then dwarves have longer lifespans than us.
So Durin's sort of the founding patriarch of this entire tribe.
Right. So Durin was the founding patriarch. And so Thorin's family originally lived not at the Lonely Mountain, which is where our quest is taking us in this book. They originally lived in the Mines of Moria. So where we're currently at is the Misty Mountains. So if you look at the map in the book, it's basically the huge mountain chain that runs north to south throughout it.
I'm gonna open up the map right now just so I can follow along here. This is, for most of you, this is going to be the second map in your book, I believe.
Yeah, it's the one of not just a singular mountain.
You see the long chain of the Misty Mountains on the left, and a big old forest of Mirkwood in the middle. And to the right, you see the Lonely Mountain.
Right. So, all right. So we touched on a little bit of geography. We're heading east throughout this whole book. I don't know if we specifically said that, but we did say in the last episode we finally got to the map. So Bilbo's house, if we're looking at this map of Wilderland, which is what this is, it should say that somewhere. Bilbo's house is west of the edge of the wild. And you can see Rivendell at the western edge of this map. Then we get into the Misty Mountains. And so we're crossing basically somewhere that's parallel with Rivendell, but the Mines of Moria are actually further south in this mountain chain.
Okay.
So that's where Durin's people originally lived, and Durin was the name of the original head of the family, but then eventually for like a couple generations, like 7 generations or something like that, everybody was just named Durin, because kind of like an everlasting thing, kind of to confuse you, kind of like...
Yeah, because people like to do that back then. We couldn't think of any other names.
Eventually, though, something drives them out. I'm not going to say what here, but...
Another failure to spoil the future, Patrick?
I'm not going to say what here.
The takeaway I'm getting is Moria is the old kingdom of Thorin's extended tribe. They no longer live there. Haven't lived there for a long time.
They were driven out by something that's known as Durin's Bane.
Durin's Bane. So something evil.
Yes.
I'm going to assume. Mm-hmm. So they've left. So his tribe has left Moria. Do they go to the Lonely Mountain now?
Yeah. So eventually they go east, which, if we look at the maps, the Lonely Mountain is east of the Misty Mountains. So eventually they end up going east, and they all settle at the Lonely Mountain. They end up prospering there. This is kind of what Thorin's talking about.
When he was giving a little bit of his closer family history, like his grandfather and father, right?
Yeah. So they settled at the Lonely Mountain, but eventually they even did a couple mini migrations to like the Iron Hills, which Thorin actually still currently has references there. But eventually they ended up at the Lonely Mountain. And to where Thorin was a youngster and his grandfather was still alive and his father was still alive, and they were very prosperous there. Mm-hmm. But then all of a sudden, as we've heard in the first chapter, Smog attack drove them out. They all left, and they were reduced to basically wandering around wherever they could find work. And so they were wandering around. Thorin ends up settling all the way to the west of the map in the Blue Mountains, which are actually near Bilbo's house. And Bilbo's house, as we just said, is even more west of the map of Wilderland than we have in the book. So now, eventually, Thorin's grandpa, who we knew was Thror, so it goes Thror, Thorin's father Thrain, then Thorin.
Thor, Thrain, Thorin.
Yeah. So Thror was the current ruler when Smaug attacked. Now, eventually, Thror kind of just goes nuts, like he loses his marbles, and he's going crazy, and he's just like, you know what? I want to see what's going on in Moria. That was our original homeland. Let me go see what's going on there. I don't know what I'm going to see, but let's just go. So he goes to Moria, and it turns out, by this point, a bunch of goblins have taken over the place. There's one head goblin who's known as Azog, the Pale Orc. He's actually in the movies, just for anybody, just as a reference. Not that we're gonna actually give the movies much credit here, but he's in the movies. He's the Pale Orc who's the bad guy throughout the thing. He murders Thror in cold blood, cuts his head off, everything like that. And so now Thror...
Pretty brutal.
It was brutal.
Okay. So what next?
Azog was so bold about it that he murders Thror, and then he just sends the head back to Thorin and Thrain's family to just let them know, yeah, Thror's dead. Like, we're the goblins. We're messing with you dwarves. And so then there were 7 houses of the dwarves. 7 ancient houses. And the most prized among them was Durin's house. And Thror was the heir of Durin.
By houses, these are sort of like tribes, right?
Yeah, you could say tribes, yeah. So now, all of a sudden, Thrain, Thorin's dad, and Thorin, they're all pissed about this. And they're just like, basically to defend their family's honor. And they're the most noble tribe of the dwarves. They call all the other dwarves tribes to come and help them in a battle to fight these goblins to just avenge Thror. This leads to the Goblin Wars up and down the whole chain of the Misty Mountains.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not just Durin's line, it's all the dwarves ever. They're all coming to defend the honor of the most noble line of the dwarves, basically, and they're going to fight the goblins, and it's huge, ruthless battle. It takes a couple years to just, basically root every goblin stronghold out that they can find throughout the Misty Mountains. And it all culminates with this huge battle at the eastern gates of Moria.
Okay.
So the goblins control Moria inside, and then Thrain, who's the dad, leads the dwarf army, and they have a huge fight here.
Okay, so basically we got all the dwarves fighting all the goblins, and it's culminating in a giant battle. And Thorin and his dad are at the front of it.
Right, so a couple things happen here. Thorin is in the battle, and he's fighting, and all of a sudden his shield gets cloven in two. So he's out on the middle of the plains or whatever, but he's near at least a patch of trees, maybe a forest or something like that. And so when his shield's broken and done, he ends up grabbing a tree branch, an oak branch, and he uses that for the rest of the battle as his shield and also as a club to kind of beat people up with. And so that is actually where he gets the name Thorin Oakenshield. So it came from this battle.
Very interesting.
That's a pretty epic name, Oakenshield, and it came from a pretty epic battle, which is what this was.
So Thorin's very name is an insult to the goblins.
Yeah, I'd say in a way, yeah. They wouldn't like to hear the name of Oakenshield.
Okay, because they remember this battle. It's part of their collective suffering.
Right. Now, one dwarf who's a cousin of Thorin, so he's like the same generation as Thorin, but he's like a cousin or a second cousin or something like that. His name is Dane, and he's very young at this battle, but he actually goes all the way up, and Azog, the Pale Orc, who's the leader of the goblins, is fighting right outside the doors of Moria and everything like that. And so Dane goes up, and he goes one-on-one and fights with Azog, and he ends up actually killing Azog. Just straight up, completely dead. The movie made it seem like, oh, he only got, part of his arm cut off or something like that. And it's no, he died. He was absolutely dead as a doornail at this battle. Dane killed him. This is where Dane, raises to prominence and everything like that.
Okay, so it's a pretty big deal.
Yeah. Well, first of all, he's young. Second of all, just refute the movie. No, Azog died at this battle. Don't believe what the movie said, because they get this completely wrong. That's what I'm saying here. But yeah, so Dane kills him, and then he kills him right at the doorway at the steps of Moria. And he actually looks inside Moria to kind of just to see what's up. And the only dwarf that had been there before was Thror, and he died.
Right.
And before that, it was like Durin's people when they were driven out by Durin's Bane, whatever that is.
Way in the past.
Yeah. So he ends up seeing Durin's Bane when he looks in there. We don't know what that is, but it's something evil, and it's pretty scary.
Okay. So he turns right around, or what?
Well, so eventually the dwarves win the battle because Azog's dead. You know, you got people like Thorin being badasses, getting names like Oakenshield. And so they win the battle, but of course, the dwarves also take huge losses through it. Mm-hmm. Thrain, again, is Thorin's dad. He's like, sweet, yeah, we won the battle. Yeah, cool. Let's go take back Moria now. Because, you know, we lost Lonely Mountain because this dragon Smog's there. But it's like, yeah, let's take Moria. But then all the dwarves that aren't part of Durin's tribe are kind of like, nah, dude, like...
Yeah, we did our due diligence fighting for your people. We're done now.
Yeah, we did the honorable thing and we answered your call and fought. But, you know, we don't want any part of Moria. And then Thrain's looking at his own guys. Well, are you guys going to enter with me? And... they all say no because they're all sad and tired from the battle and everything. And then Dane, who did look inside the Mines of Moria, he's just like, nah, dude. The world must change and some other power than ours must come before Durin's folk walk again in Moria.
Pretty foreboding. So, we've got a historic... We understand why the goblins and the dwarves don't get along. It's because of this battle that Thorin is directly connected to. It's Thorin's dad who led the charge to avenge Thorin's grandfather against the goblins. They won the battle, but both sides took great losses and effectively went back home, right? Because at the end of the day, the goblins still control the Mines of Moria. The dwarves went away, and... the goblins continued to spread after these wars, right?
I would assume, you know, it's hard to root out every single goblin in the whole mountain range because, you know, they live underground.
They're like vermin.
So they probably didn't get all the goblins, but however the goblins breed or whatever like that, the goblins that lost this battle are related to the goblins that capture Thorin and his friends here. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the dwarves end up winning the battle, but... like we saw at the beginning of the first chapter, Thorin went back to basically like blacksmith work or something in the mountains that are near Bilbo's house. And it wasn't until he met Gandalf that they were like, all right, cool. Let's go on this adventure to reclaim the Lonely Mountain. Mines of Moria, not for us right now, but we can still get back at least to the Lonely Mountain.
Interesting. So I feel like I have a better sense of the dwarves now and what's motivating them, and perhaps what's motivating the goblins when they see the dwarves.
Right. I mean, there's just, yeah, it's like when you see like the goblins capturing the dwarves here and they hear about Thorin Oakenshield, I mean, there's more than just like the little kid's story here. When he originally wrote the story, there probably was not actually more. But in the whole mythology of Middle-earth, yeah, there's more going on than just 13 dwarves were captured by goblins. It's like, no. A pack of goblins who absolutely hate the specific dwarves that they captured. They're going to finish them off kind of thing. And they would have if it wasn't thanks to Gandalf.
Who saves the day at the exact right instant yet again. Funny how that happens.
Funny how that happens, or, you know, Gandalf really knows what he's doing, or there's more to it like we've said in other episodes.
I can be your hero, baby.
So, the hero's journey. We've come to the fourth step, the crossing of the first threshold. Patrick, what does this mean for us and for our hero, Bilbo Baggins?
So, crossing the first threshold, you know, maybe we hit this with the trolls or something like that, but I thought it was more applicable here when we finally left the last homely home, a very comfortable place, and now we're really in it.
Well, before we get into Bilbo crossing the first threshold, what is this step in the hero's journey? What does it mean in general?
This is where you leave the limits of your own world and enter the dangerous realm where rules and limits are unknown.
So this step is often described as going down the rabbit hole. So to cue off some of our examples, I thought of Alice in Wonderland, where Alice literally goes down the rabbit hole. It's the point in the story where you're effectively the furthest from your comfort zone that you've ever been before. The heroes entered effectively a new world where new rules apply, new codes of conduct are required. All of the understanding that the heroes got of how things are supposed to go has been turned upside down.
You have no idea what to expect from here. You have no control of it whatsoever, and it's not like anything that you're used to beforehand.
So what are some other examples?
Well, so we're going to keep riding out Star Wars, as we have been. So this is the point in Star Wars 4, New Hope, where Luke's already met Obi-Wan, and he's agreed, like, fine, yeah, I'll go on this crazy adventure with you, mostly because I have nothing else to do, because my whole life here is destroyed. So I'll go on this crazy adventure with you, and they end up going to this one kind of scumbag town called Mos Eisley. This is the town where they see all the stormtroopers, and then they meet Han Solo, and Han's like, all right, cool, I'll give you a ride in my ship. And then as they agree to go with Han, then all these stormtroopers all of a sudden start attacking him. So this is like the first time that Luke's experiencing danger and violence on his own life personally, up close. And so, I mean, this is his first brush with kind of danger, kind of
total chaos.
Yeah, total chaos. Yeah, I mean, and now he's really in it. Like, yeah, he's just basically a wanted man at this point with everybody else that's on his ship.
Another one I thought of for any of you Miyazaki fans out there, in Spirited Away, this is the point at which Chihiro she crosses over the bridge to the tea house, the kind of temple-looking building. She's officially entered a world of fantasy that is beyond what she's ever known or understood. And suddenly it's a different understanding, and she's completely on her own and has to play by new rules.
Yeah, so I've watched maybe 5 minutes of that movie when I was younger, and it creeped me out. So we're also going to mention just this example here.
Hello.
Well, hi.
Name's Bruce. It's all right, I understand. Why trust a shark, right? So, what's a couple of bites like you doing out so late, eh?
Nothing. We're not doing anything. We're not even out.
Great! Then how'd you morsels like to come to a little get-together I'm having?
You mean like a party?
Yeah, right. A party. What do you say?
Oh, I love parties. That sounds like fun.
You know, parties are fun.
Finding Nemo there, if you didn't know, Clifford. Did you know that? Did you know?
I'm well aware, Patrick.
Yeah?
I bet I've seen Finding Nemo as many times as you have.
All right, okay. So, yeah, I mean, that's where Nemo was taken at that point, but that's where basically Marlin and Dory's adventure really begins. That's their first brush with somebody that's scary. Because, like, sometimes this thing is, sometimes it's like an actual, like, threshold guardian kind of thing. Like the ogre under a bridge, you know, like how you have to pay a toll kind of thing. Like, that's kind of a common thing.
Right.
I think that one kind of reflects it well. Another real-world example I was kind of thinking of would have been Columbus and his crew when they set sail from Spain looking for India. And, you know, they're kind of scared that, oh, maybe we'll fall off the planet, or, you know, maybe we'll just run out of food while we're on the open sea. That would have been my biggest fear, personally. Well, once they got there, it's like, oh, who knows? They didn't know it, but you're in a completely different place that very few Europeans have actually found at this point. And, like, yeah, there's absolutely, you do not know what's there or what's coming.
Okay. So, how does this tie back to The Hobbit? What threshold does Bilbo cross, and what does it mean for him?
He left Rivendell, which was a pretty nice, comfortable stay. I mean, those kind of come up along the way. Like we were saying before, I mean, the trolls, it's like, oh, they were kind of scary. They were kind of like something new, but they were kind of just like goofy. I mean, I don't know. I almost saw them basically as like a warm-up thing. Now they...
Yeah, it's like a hiccup or a speed bump.
Yeah, now they met the real danger. Now they're crossing the mountains and literally entering into a place called Wilderland, or Wilder Land. I mean, there's no holds bars for what's coming next, kind of thing.
I thought that you've got a pretty literal threshold as well. He's entered the mountain. He's gone into the back of the cave. It comes about in a fantastical sort of way where he emerges from a dream, and all of a sudden everything's been completely upset. All of the norms that he's accepted have been taken away.
The other steps really started us off, but now this was the first step that really puts us in the thick of things on this hero's journey. Now if we weren't in it before, we're absolutely in it now.
And this threshold has thrown Bilbo into a whole slew of new challenges and adventures that we'll see next time on Talkin' Tolkien.
Yep. But before we sign off, let's just do some little household keeping here. We still haven't, by the time of this, we still haven't released the first episode, but we're getting real close. We just gotta wait for a couple more things to get set up, then we'll be all set.
Flashback to the past.
Yeah. But in the meantime, please, if you have any questions for us or want to reach out or like give us feedback on how we're doing or constructive or just negative criticism in general, you can email us at talkingtokenpodcast@gmail.com. Like I've said before, our Twitter, I screwed up, is at Tolkien Talking. You know, you'd think it'd be reasonable for me to just restart it, but we're just going to roll. And
the Instagram account is at Talkin' Tolkien Podcast, just as it's spelled on the website. I believe there is a G after talking.
Yes.
Not talking.
Yeah.
Like I like to say it.
Same. Is that a Chicago thing that we don't pronounce our G's? Or is that like, which?
I think that's just a slang thing in general.
For all dialects whatsoever? Or all accents whatsoever?
For the most part, I think so. It's a weird sound to make. Also, it happens to play nicely into our alliteration with Tolkien. Tolkien.
Good point, Clifford. Good point.
Don't tell me you didn't notice that before.
No, talking whatever was based off something else.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, anyways.
Right.
We should have a Facebook page. Please leave us reviews. As we said, cleverest, wittiest, heartwarmingest reviews will be awarded prizes in the form of a coveted limited edition beer koozie. So if you want warm hands as you drink a cold beer and you want that beer to stay colder for a slight more amount of time, write us a good review and you'll get it.
More like if you want to be the envy of all your friends with a sweet podcast koozie.
Yeah, check out our website too. Other than that, we got Chapter 5 coming up. That's a big one. That is a big one. We'll have ramifications beyond this book without an absolute doubt. Clifford, you got anything else?
I don't believe so. I'm looking forward to the next chapter. Bilbo is unconscious. Thanks, y'all.